It's been almost 50 years since a tragic event occurred at Lenin's Peak, but very few know the story. One person in particular, Elvira Shatayeva, showed outstanding leadership skills. But sadly enough, she and her team never returned down the mountain. So, who was Elvira Shatayeva, and how did she die? Stay tuned to find out. It was June 1974, and the Cold War was verging on détente. However, the Watergate scandal overshadowed the Moscow summit between President Richard Nixon and his Soviet counterpart, Leonid Brezhnev. About a month later, thousands of miles away in Central Asia, somewhere close to the Himalayas, in the shadow of Peak Lenin, there was another meeting between an American and a Russian. Around this time, about 170 climbers from several countries occupied a huge mountaineering camp in the southern part of the Soviet Union. Right now, this is the border of what's now Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. These climbers camped in the Pamir Mountains, or Pamirs, which is a range that has some of the highest mountains in the world. Most of these climbers would try to reach Peak Lenin's top, which was about 7,134 meters high. This is about 23,406 feet. However, only a few would make it to the top. And this isn't because it was steep or technical. It's just that it's very high and subject to severe weather. The first time Molly Higgins saw Elvira Shatayeva, she was coming around a bend in the high Pamirs mountain range. This range is sometimes called the roof of the world. At the time, Higgins was an outward-bound instructor who traveled to the Colorado Rockies, living out of a faded white sedan. Higgins was here on an invitation for a month-long international mountaineering gathering hosted by the Russians. There were 19 Americans, including 2 women, who attended as part of the 1974 American Pamirs USSR expedition. Higgins, who was only 24, was invited at the last minute. This was when the organizers, most unsure or uneasy about where women fit in on expeditions, realized that one woman was insufficient. Higgins was with a crew that was carrying loads up to Camp 2, Crevasse Camp, toward Krylenko Pass on the shoulder of Peak Lenin. This was the second highest mountain. However, little did they know that there was going to be an earthquake that would shake the slopes. Higgins recalls hearing a creaking sound, and with no time, she could hear an avalanche roaring overhead, coming off the top of the ice tower above camp. The avalanche was so intense that it darkened the air, scattered gear, and partially buried one person. 2 others managed to save themselves by jumping into the crevasse to escape. 4 people from the crew had already gone down the slope to get more supplies, and for hours, those in both groups dreaded that the others had died. Luckily, they had all survived. However, one of their members, Alan Steck, a pioneering climber from Berkeley, California, was buried up to his neck. Eventually, the 2 groups joyfully reunited at Camp 1 on the Krylenko moraine. And after regrouping, they retreated, shaken, to base camp in an alpine meadow. All the climbers were here for the first American expedition that was allowed in the Soviet Union, which has some of the highest and most remote mountains in the world. The gathering was held to showcase the region and the skills of the host climbers. In addition, it seemed that it was also able to develop relationships with Cold War rivals. During this time, it was seen as a means to bring up young mountaineers and foster mountaineering relations between countries. At the time, no one would have imagined that a lot of things would go wrong that summer. The events rained down from the skies and were upthrusted by the earth, and even the heroics that would come after were all unexpected. But even with all that, one of the greatest disasters in mountaineering is almost completely forgotten. Almost no one today, even some of the most famous climbers, have ever heard about what happened to 8 Russian women in 1974. Higgins would remember that day years later, saying, "We came down through these huge boulders, around a corner, and there, Standing up was this absolutely gorgeous, bright, blue-eyed, muscular, bossy hottie on a boulder. And she's got about 4 Russian guys around her, and she's ordering them around. According to Higgins, this woman was in her mid-30s. Shettyeva spotted an American, Mike Yakel, limping. This was after he had to jump into the crevasse beside Camp 2 to save himself from the avalanche. When Shatayeva saw this, she yelled, "He is injured! Take his pack!" Shettyeva then went ahead to wheel around, looked at Higgins and said in a deep, careful tone, "I am Elvira Shatayeva. I am a master of sports. What are you?" At the time, the Master of Sport was one of the top credentials in any sport in the status-conscious Soviet Union. The title would be even more impressive if a woman were holding it. Higgins recalled thinking it was great. She said, "I didn't want to be bossy like that, but here was a woman who really was capable. I wanted to be like her, that strong and that experienced. She was a heroine right there." During this era, there were relatively few female climbers. In all this time, Higgins had never come across someone who was the kind of climber and mountaineer she wanted to be. It was to be the young American's only interaction with Elvira. At the time, Arlene Blum, a biophysical chemist and environmentalist from Berkeley, California, had applied to be part of the American Alpine Club and joined the American contingent, but was declined. However, she later got an invitation from an international women's climbing club to be part of the women's team. The situation created an awkward dynamic when Blum, who was 29, got to the Pamirs and entered the jam-packed mess tent. She remembers when Shettyeva introduced herself and welcomed Blum. And as they talked, she told Blum that most Soviet men thought that a team of women would never succeed in climbing the top of Peak Lenin, which was her group's aim. At the time, Shettyeva told her, "We plan to be the first women's team to do it. Or maybe your group will be." However, when Blum proposed that they climb together, Shettyeva replied that it was impossible. Blum could only conclude that the Soviets wanted the first women's team to be their own. Shettyeva went on to tell Blum the larger plan. She planned that the 8 women would climb the peak by the Lipkin Ridge on the northeast side and descend the northwest ridge toward the smaller Razdelny Peak. Theirs would be the first traverse by men and women of the peak. They were to bivouac or make a temporary camp on top. At the time, Shettyeva said, "Soviet women are strong. We have collective spirit, and we work together." During this meeting, no one predicted the weather would be out of control, and there was no way anyone could control the weather or geology. The whole Pamir's meet was eventually plagued by snow, a rapidly developing avalanche hazard, an earthquake that shook avalanches down, with 2 more earthquakes later, and the worst storm seen in the region in 25 years. On July 26 at about 1 a.m., 4 climbers forging a new route on the north face of Peak of the 19th Party Congress, better known as Peak 19, were hit by an avalanche while sleeping. 2 American climbers were buried in this incident, while 1 other person was crushed. Even before the doomed Soviet women began their ascent up the mountain, 6 climbers, including 5 Estonians, were caught in an avalanche and killed on Peak Lenin. But despite all the hazards that were there at the time, the Soviet climbers still persisted. All were among the most experienced in their country. 4 of them, including Elvira Shatayeva, had all gone up Peak Lenin before. No matter how hard the women tried to ride out the storm by huddling together in their tents, the winds still ripped the fabric apart, exposing all of them to sub-zero temperatures. 2 days later, they radioed their base camp, which was 10,000 feet below, claiming that 1 team member was already dead and 2 others were sick. 2 more died as they tried to descend to a warmer, more sheltered position. And by afternoon, 3 survivors were so ill that they couldn't move. The final radio message was sent on the evening of the third day of the storm. Thanks all for this heartbreaking story. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And remember, stay safe and never stop exploring.